Hello, my name is Nuno, and today I'll be talking about this short paper whose title is The Main Conclusion, which is that pulse arrival time is not an adequate surrogate for pulse transit time as a marker of blood pressure. So, as a little bit of background, whenever you measure blood pressure, you get these pulse waveforms shown here, and the minimum here of the pulse waveform is called the foot point. And so the pulse transit time is defined as the time delay between foot points on the same sort of heartbeat, but where the first is measured near the heart, such as like the aorta, and then the second is measured in some periphery, like the leg. And from that, we can also kind of estimate the pulse wave velocity, which is just the time derivative of this and is inversely proportional to the pulse transit time, or PTT. And this is important because the Mohs-Korteweg equation relates the pulse wave velocity to the elastic modulus of the blood vessel walls. And this is again important because we know that blood pressure is directly correlated with the this elastic modulus because the tenser the blood vessel walls are, the greater the blood pressure. And so what this means is that blood pressure is going to be directly correlated to the pulse wave velocity and the inverse of the pulse transit time. And just one final thing, instead of taking a measurement of the pulse waveforms near the heart, you can instead do an ECG and measure where the R peak happens, and then measure the time difference to the foot of the pulse wave at some peripheral region. And that gets you your pulse arrival time. And this is easier to measure because it's easier to do an ECG than to get the pulse waveforms near the heart. However, the problem is that this new PAT, or pulse arrival time, has a little PEP, or PEP, or pre-ejection period added onto it, which is the time that it takes for blood to between the R peak on the ECG and blood to exit the heart. And this PEP is sort of noisy because it can be affected by heart contractility as well as afterload, which is the blood found or the pressure that the heart has to overcome inside the ventricles when it's pumping. So given that the motivation for the study is that since this PEP is a non-significant part of the PAT, it adds some noise to the potential estimation of blood pressure as compared to when we use pulse transit time to estimate blood pressure. And there's limited research so far, or up to 2011 when this paper was written, on the comparison between PAT and PTT. So they wanted to look at how does pulse arrival time compare to pulse transit time in estimating blood pressure. And they cited a couple papers that have looked at this in the past, and they found some mixed results that sometimes, in some studies, it was saying that yes, PAT can be used, and others it said that it didn't. But there were a couple limitations in these papers, such as a small blood pressure range that was looked at, which could not be applicable to higher ranges, as well as just low sample size or just perhaps issues with the measurement that was taken in the first place. And so for this study, the authors recruited six healthy beagles, 10 to 12 kilograms, and they're supposedly healthy. The paper doesn't actually go into any detail in how they decided, the dogs, like more characteristics about them. They instead point to another paper that offers a little bit more detail, but even still, it's a little bit inadequate. But yeah, I had to search through a paper that was made by the same group to get a little bit more detail. So I think that was a little bit of an error, or a little bit unfortunate that I had to do that, and I wish it wasn't the case. Also, the authors never mention how this research on dogs might apply to humans, but they did get approval from Michigan State University for this experiment. And so in terms of how they actually collected data, they used these micromanometer tipped catheters that can both measure the blood pressure, as well as, since they're getting a time series of the blood pressure, they can figure out when the pulse times, or the foot of the pulse waves, are happening. And they did this in two regions. One was the ascending aorta, which is near the heart, and the other is the femoral artery, which is in the periphery, which is in the leg. They also used an ECG to measure the ECG waveforms, where they were able to get the R waves and what time they were occurring, and they did all these measurements at 500 hertz, which is quite good. And so from these measurements, they were able to extract what they really wanted, which was one, where are the feet of these pulse waves? And as you can see here, this is sort of how they approximated it using these two intersecting tangent lines that was suggested by another previous paper. And they used that to get what times the feet of these pulses were occurring at. Uh, and they also, since they had the time at which the ECG was happening, they were able to define the pulse arrival time as the difference in time between the R wave and the subsequent foot of the femoral artery. And then the PTT was similar, but instead of the R wave, you're using the foot of the blood pressure pulse wave in the ascending aorta. They also looked at three parameters of blood pressure. That was diastolic, systolic, and the mean blood pressure, which is just averaged across one cardiac cycle, because they wanted to see how prediction accuracy might vary. And for each dog, they got a baseline measurement of all of these things, as well as they gave each dog a different combination of interventions, 2 to 4 interventions, out of a total of 12 different interventions that they looked at to see how the prediction accuracy differed in that as well. In terms of statistical analyses, they use linear regression for their prediction, where you're trying to predict y based on some variable x, where in this case, the y, they tried three different ones, the diastolic, mean, and systolic blood pressure. And then for the x variable, they tried PTT, PAT, as well as their reciprocals. But I question why they even used the reciprocals at all, or sorry, why they used the non-reciprocals, because as I explained in the background section, the theory behind this entire experiment here predicts that blood pressure is correlated with the reciprocal, not the non-reciprocal. So I don't know why they bothered even testing that, to be honest. Um, then to actually get a measure of how good these variables were at predicting blood pressure, they used the root mean squared error, or the RMSE, which is shown in this equation here, and it's just sort of a measure of the errors where lower RMSE means a better predictor. However, I question again why they didn't just use R squared, which can standardize across for different units, and I think that would have been more helpful for the reader who might have better understanding of how R squared works. And then finally, they used an ANOVA to find differences between the measurements across the different groups that they tested, as well as a post hoc t-tests to measure differences or assess the significance between differences of different groups. And so in terms of the results, they find pretty clearly that pulse transit time is better than pulse arrival time for this, and that you can see that because in the green boxes, the RMSE is typically lower than in the red boxes, which is where the PAT predictions are. And they also find that taking the reciprocal of either pulse transit or pulse arrival times was better than taking the non-reciprocal. And again, you can see that because the green boxes have lower RMSE than the corresponding red boxes that are found above it that are the reciprocal, or sorry, the non-reciprocal, I should say, sorry. And they've also found that the diastolic blood pressure and mean blood pressure were better for predicting than the systolic blood pressure. And again, you can see that because the root mean squared error in the green box was lower than in the red box. However, I question for these comparisons why they didn't just do an overall linear regression where they're taking the root mean squared error and predicting that based on the blood pressure type that they were predicting, as well as the predictor type and whether it was a reciprocal or not. I think that would have gotten you sort of closer to, or much more quickly and perhaps in a more interpretable way, which combination here of measurements lead to the best prediction. So overall, they found that for predicting blood pressure, pulse arrival time is worse than pulse transit time. The non-reciprocal is also worse than the reciprocal, and they tested a couple non-linear polynomial regressions, but for some reason they didn't show these at all in the results. They just briefly mentioned them in the discussion that they did look at them, but they just that it didn't cause much of a difference in their findings. And also overall, systolic blood pressure is worse at being predicted than this diastolic or mean blood pressure. And all these results were consistent with the literature as they talked about in their discussion, and they confirmed that this pre-ejection period is a confounding factor in the prediction of blood pressure when using PAT. They also do mention that there's some limitations with their experiment, which is that the way that it's set up, it's more ideal than in real life scenarios. For example, they use the same data, same blood pressure data, for their training of their prediction as well as for assessing the prediction, which is kind of a big no-no in a lot of other fields. And I think if it was in those fields, it would get criticized for that. So I think they should have split up their samples into a testing and a training cohort. And also, they manually corrected these misdetections, which perhaps in real life scenarios wouldn't occur. But they actually say that because R waves are easier to automatically detect than the feet of pulse waves, that actually might mean that the pulse arrival time would be relatively more accurate in real life scenarios to pulse transit time compared to in their ideal scenario. And as I mentioned, they never generalized to humans or talked about how they could generalize to humans. But overall, this paper was still significant because it showed that pulse arrival time should not be used to predict blood pressure, as the error in this prediction actually exceeds the FDA's guidelines for bias and precision. And also, they suggest that future research should look at how to better measure pulse transit time using the proximal arterial waveforms, as well as coming up with ways that are patient specific of translating pulse transit time prediction to actual blood pressure. And I would suggest that I think they should also try to replicate this in humans. But yeah, these are my references, and thank you.